Okay guys, welcome back to Revive School. Here we are in Job 39 through 40. Now, just so you know, you're almost done with Job. There's 42 chapters. We're not going to finish it this week, but that's okay. You know, what we started yesterday was something that Job has been asking for, honestly, for all of the book. He wants to have a conversation with God. Why? Because he's been suffering. He's lost his kids. He's lost all of his possessions. He's lost his animals. He's lost his servants. And then what do you know? He was like, okay, fine. All of my friends are calling me out. They say I'm a sinner. I'm not a sinner. I mean, I have my issues, but I'm not. There's nothing major in my life. And then he even gets to the point, it was like, do a whole sweep of my life. He addresses all of these sins, and he's like, they're not here. And so as he starts to identify these sins that aren't in his life, he kind of started to feel like, you know, I'm justified. I'm righteous. And so Elihu comes into the picture, a mediator, and he says, no, you're not. Because if you are, you're starting to call yourself a very prideful person. You're starting to have the wrong motives. And so Elihu calls him out, and then he says, hey, by the way, you probably should start praising the Lord because you become more about yourself than about God. And so yesterday we talked about God finally addressing all of the things that Job's been wanting to know. And it wasn't pretty. 77 questions you're going to see unfold truly from Job 38, you guys, all the way through Job 42. You're going to see the Lord show up in an incredible, powerful way. And that first message yesterday was considered his first speech. And you're going to see today in Job 40 the conclusion of this speech. Now, in 38, we're obviously talking about the creation. The one thing I want to make sure that we mention in Job 39 is that God, he goes through 6 animals and different kinds of birds. He talks about the mountain goats. He talks about the deer. He talks about the wild donkey. He talks about the wild ox in verse 10. In verse 13, he talks about the wings of the ostrich flap joyfully. He even talks about the horse. It says in verse 19, he talks about the locusts in verse 20. And then he continues on about talking about the horse as it continues on at the rest of 39. As you'll see in verse 26, he talks about the hawk. In verse 27, he talks about the eagles. Why I want to go there is because we're going to spend a whole lot of time in Job 40 on one animal. I can't believe we're going to teach a lesson on one animal. And are you ready for this? It's nothing like any of these animals we've listed. The animal we're going to describe is nothing like a deer. It's nothing like an ox, nothing like an ostrich, as ugly as that sucker is. You know, it's nothing like a hawk. It's nothing like an eagle. It's in a category all by itself. So it fits, though. God is describing, okay, you got to understand something. God is describing to Job, I've made all of this. And then where he's going to go in Job 40 at the end is basically, since I've made all of this, do you actually think you could actually oversee and subdue this stuff that I've made? Do you think that you could actually control what I've made? And that's where we're going to go today. And so I want to walk through just kind of a bigger picture here. The challenge that God makes. Tom Constable, former professor at Dallas Theological Seminary, he says this: God's first speech, which we've already addressed, is in Job 38 and 39 at the end of 40. God's first speech began and ended with a challenge to Job. Job had found fault with God for allowing him to suffer when he was godly. That was Job's fault. He called out God and said, God, you got an issue because you're making me suffer when I didn't do anything wrong. And so Job wanted to meet God in court face to face. He wanted God's injustice. He wanted this injustice to come out, and he wanted to hear God's actual response. And that's where we're going to go today. Scripture says this in Job 40, verse 1, the Lord answered Job, will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? I'm sorry? Will the one who has an issue with me go ahead and correct me? Let him who argues with God go ahead, give me an answer. And now Job gets to answer. I mean, I probably would just put it on a piece of paper and slide it over to him. It says that Job answered the Lord. So this is the first time Job is responding to God's first speech, okay? Now, again, this is kind of important to understand. Earlier, Kevin, if you go to Job 9, verse 14, okay? Earlier, Job had hesitated to confront Job 9:14. Earlier in the beginning of the chapter, Job had hesitated to confront God. This is what he said. He said, how can I answer him or choose my arguments against him? This was Job's tone before he went through life. How could I come up with an answer? There's no way I could have an argument against God. Okay, so you're going to see this interesting progression. So Job clearly, was hesitant to address God. And that's going to come from Job 9:14. Now, Kevin, if you would you go to Job 13:22? What you're going to see is that Job became gradually more confident. And in Job 13:22, he says, then call and I will answer, or I will speak and you can respond to me. So Job became more confident and he demanded an audience with God. And then it gets actually even worse. If you go to Job 31:37, he was so arrogant that he identified himself as a prince. In Job 31:37, he says this, I would give him an account of all of my steps. I would approach him like a prince. What he's saying is, man, I know every single thing that I've done. I have nothing to hide. I'm going to come to him like a prince. And so there's this, Job became, can I just say, arrogant in his approach. Job 31:37. Okay, now remember, this is the Job that was building. This was the Job that was getting to this point. So in verse 3, when you see Job's first reply to God, Job answered the Lord. Look what he says in verse 4. I am so insignificant. How can I answer you? I place my hand over my mouth. I am so insignificant. How can I answer you? I place my hand over my mouth. Like originally, Job, do you remember this? Let's go back for a second. Kevin, if you go to Job 21:5. Originally, Job told his friends to cover their mouth. Look at me and shudder. Put your hand over your mouth. I'm tired of your comments. He tells his friends, put your hand over your mouth. Strangely enough, in Job 29, verse 9. Job 29:9, it says, remember, he's before the Lord. In Job 29, it says, city officials stopped talking and they covered their mouths with their hands when they saw Job. So Job tells his friends, put your hands on your mouth. People start seeing Job. They put their hands over their mouth. And now Job, the same situation is happening to him. He's so repulsed by himself. He's got to put his hand over his mouth. I'm totally insignificant. In verse 5, he says, I have spoken once and I will not reply. Twice, but now I can add nothing. I have nothing to say. God, you win. Everything that you have said, yep, I agree. And just like that, God says, oh, I'm not done yet. In verse 6, it's where it begins what we would consider God's second speech. We've already had the first speech. Now God is going to begin the second speech because you got to love Job's answer. I put my hand on my mouth. I'm done talking. I got nothing. I have nothing to bring to the table. And you would kind of think maybe after that, God's like, okay, Job. He's like, no, look, you're the nail. I'm going to hammer you. Like, this is kind of the mentality. Like, I'm going to do this. So then he says in verse 6, then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. So this whirlwind is just, it's continuing. And in verse 7, God says this. Get ready to answer me like a man. When I question you, you will inform me. So if I'm going to give you one of the 77 questions, I need answers. Like I need solid answers, not the, I don't know an answer. Like I don't want that, God says. I want you to tell me. Why? Because if you're going to think who you are, really, you need to show up. Really wouldn't want to be Job in this place. In verse 8, God's not done. He says, would you really challenge my justice? Would you declare me guilty to justify yourself? Do you have an arm like God's? Can you thunder with a voice like His? In other words, what you're going to see in verses 9 through 14, do you really have the strength and the wrath to judge sinners. Can you really pull this off? And here's the best, I think this is one of my favorite parts of honestly, of all of Job. In verse 10 it says, adorn yourself with majesty and splendor and clothe yourself with honor and glory. You know what he's really saying? Go ahead. I want you to go back to the judge's chambers. I want you to put on the judge's robe and I want you to come out. Like, go ahead, adorn with whatever clothes you want that's going to make you feel legit. Because I have to tell you, it's not going to work. In verse 11, unleash your raging anger. Look on every proud person and humiliate him. Go ahead, make sure you got your clothes on. Look on every proud person and humble him. Trample the wicked where they stand. Oh, and by the way, hide them together in the dust. Imprison them in the grave. When you do all of that, then I will confess to you that your own right hand can deliver you. Whew. Mister, I got my judge clothes on, and you can go ahead and trample the wicked, and you can go ahead and look on every proud person and humble them. You can go ahead and release your raging anger and humiliate them, those people. When you do all that, then I will go ahead and I'll realize that your right hand can actually save your own soul. I don't think it's possible. And if I'm Job, I would be like, I've already said I'm sorry. I don't know why you have to go there all the time. And then in verse 15, this is where it gets bizarre, okay? This is where, remember how I talked to you about in Job 39? I talked to you about all these different animals, the 6 beasts and the 3 birds, right? Remember I said that at the end of 40 and then going into 41, he's going to talk about 2 animals. Now, for this conversation, we're going to switch from a Bible class to an academic educational class.
Good afternoon, Dr. Martin.
Thank you. Make sure it's doctor to you, Kevin. We're going to start talking about this animal, the behemoth. In Job 40, verse 15, look at the behemoth, which I made along with you. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about the behemoth, okay? Now, there's a lot of qualities of the behemoth, okay? First of all, let's see if I want to do this now. Yeah, let's do this. He eats grass like an ox. So, if he eats grass, Rich, what does that probably make him?
It would make him an herbivore.
Yes.
It's a big word, Rich.
A big word for what?
It's a vegetarian.
A vegetarian. Yeah, he's not eating other animals. Okay, that's an interesting thought. Now, behemoth actually means beast. One commentator, and there's only one, but I like that one, so I'm going to write it down, calls him the super beast. Okay, so the behemoth eats grass, but he's a beast. I think that's weird in itself, right? Wouldn't you think a beast would be like devouring all of these other animals with meat? Nope, not the case. He eats grass. Now look at this. It says in verse 16, look at the strength of his loins and the power in the muscles of his belly. All right? He stiffens his tail like a cedar tail. The tendons of his thighs are woven firmly together. His bones are bronze tubes. His limbs are like iron rods. He is the foremost of God's works. Only his maker can draw the sword against him. The hills yield food for him, while all sorts of wild animals play there. That's because they know that he's not going to eat them. He lies under the lotus plants, hiding in the protection of marshy reeds. Lotus plants cover him with their shade. The willows by the brook surround him. Though the river rages, Behemoth is unafraid. He remains confident even if the Jordan surges up to his mouth. Can anyone capture him while he looks on or pierce his nose with snares? All right, so in describing the Behemoth, okay, there's a couple things. He eats grass. He's strong and mighty. He has a really powerful body. Okay, we've already talked about this, but he has strong muscles. He has bones like iron rods. He lounges in the river. Oh, lazy river. He is hidden, interesting enough, underwater. Okay? We've already talked about eating grass, so he'd be a vegetarian. The river doesn't frighten him. Mm-hmm. Just keep swimming. Crazy enough, he has a massive, what kind of tail? Cedar tail. And then in verse 24, can you go there for a second for me? In verse 24, it says, can anybody capture him? So he doesn't even get captured. Okay, these are the descriptions of the behemoth. Now, when you look at the possible options, what could this animal be? These are some pretty awesome characteristics. Okay, one of them is an elephant. Some people would say that the behemoth was an elephant. Guys, what do you think? Based on this description, does he eat grass?
Yeah.
Powerful body, strong muscles? Mm-hmm. How about lounging in a river?
Yep.
They hang out there.
Yeah, I think so. Back then, they probably didn't have the best ways of killing elephants. You know what I mean? It's not like arrows are going to pierce this thing. So the point is, he's probably not afraid back then. Strangely enough, though, there's one thing that doesn't work. It says that he has to have a massive cedar tail. Kevin, can we go out of the loop here for a second? Can you go to the cedar picture? So this is a cedar tree, okay? Look at the elephant's little tail. Well, all right, here's the cedar. Look, a massive cedar tree, okay? So if he's described as having a cedar tail, which, Kevin, that verse is what, verse 17? He stiffens his tail like a cedar tree. I don't think this works for the elephant. Okay, but that's a thought, okay? Now, there's another one. How about, do you have the rhinoceros for me? Now, and these dudes are bad dudes, by the way. I mean, can you imagine that guy humming at you? Now, all of these characters, I could not, as Dr. Martin, I'd like to tell you that I could tell you everything about the rhinoceros. But the only thing I can tell you at this moment in class today is his tail is not a cedar tree.
So we've got no farther on the cedars.
So we're not doing good with the elephant. We're not doing good with the rhinoceros. Kevin, how about a water buffalo? Some people would say, whoa, these dudes are seriously ugly. He was the first ever animal to have a wig. Teachers have bad jokes. That was a teacher joke. All right, but again, what do you notice? That is not his tail, by the way. And that is not coming out of his rear, just so you know, okay? He doesn't have it looks like he has a cedar tree, but he doesn't. But he is eating grass. All right, I think you get the point. It's not a water buffalo. This is what most people would say in the theological world. Okay, most of them would say it's a hippopotamus. Okay, look, everything looks pretty good.
It's from your teaching, Doctor.
Yes, thank you. It looks pretty good. He obviously, in describing the hippopotamus, he's a vegetarian, strong and mighty, powerful body, strong muscles, bones like iron rods. He loves to hang out in the river. I think that's no problem. He's hidden in the river. I think at that time, probably the same situation. Hunters would probably have a hard time capturing him, but there's still one problem. He is short and stubby at the end. His tail is not Job 40, verse 17. His tail looks nothing like a cedar tree. Nothing. Look, that's not coming on the rear end of a hippo. I think you get the point. So, interesting enough, what could this animal be? I can't believe we're talking about dinosaurs on Revive School. This is so awesome to me. What is the beast? What is the super beast? Many people think, and Ken Ham, you guys, if you've ever heard of Answers in Genesis, Ken Ham also made the life-size ark in Kentucky. One of Ken, Answers in Genesis, which I would agree with, he would say that he is probably, at one point, was a dinosaur. So at one point, the animal, the behemoth, was probably, let me give you a couple examples. Oh man, this is going to be really funny. A sauropod. You guys ever heard of a sauropod?
Nope.
Okay, it's a type of dinosaur. But then under the sauropod would have been maybe like a bronchiosaurus, okay, or an apatosaurus. The point is that this animal would have probably been 10 times heavier than an elephant. Now, look at the tail. It sure looks like Job 40, verse 17. He stiffens his tail like a cedar tree. Now, what's really interesting is that when you look at dinosaurs, you know, guys, when you talk about dinosaurs, do you have a favorite dinosaur? Rich, what's the first thing? Do you kind of get excited? Like, hey, this could be a dinosaur. What's your favorite dinosaur, Rich?
I think everybody's going to go with the T-Rex. So, you know, baby arms, big teeth, mean.
Ooh, that's a good one. Well, what I think is interesting is when you start studying the different translations of Job 40, verse 17, you know, sometimes you would think, well, maybe he stiffens his tail like a cedar tree. Might be something different. King James talks about he moveth his tail like cedar. It's a cedar tree. The NASB says he bends his tail, the cedar tree. The NIV, his tail swings and sways, cedar tree. The NKJV, he moves his tail, the cedar tree. The REV, never even heard of that one. His tail is, I can't read that.
A cedar tree.
It's a cedar tree. The Septuagint, all the way back. The Vulgate and Luther, every single one of them took the translation that his tail was like a cedar tree. Because there's no other animal out there that we know of that would even remotely describe this. So it could be truly an extinct dinosaur. Now, what's the big deal about this? Honestly, what's the big deal? For me, the big deal is dinosaurs are really cool. Like they were created, dun dun dun, you ready for this? The same day, Kevin, let's go to Genesis 1, 24 through 27. Now, whether you have the old earth or the new earth theology, Rich, at some point we still have to say God created the dinosaur, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So it doesn't matter if we're talking millions of years or thousands of years. To me, if the animal was here, if the earth was here, if the land was here, if the clouds were here, if the sun was here, if the oceans were here, God still made it. So I'm not worried about the timing of when the dinosaurs, like when they started. I just want to let you know for sure, well, for when they started, I can tell you when they started. God made them. In Genesis 1:24, let the earth produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that crawl, and the wildlife of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so, verse 25. So God made the wildlife of the earth according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and creatures that crawl on the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Verse 26. Then God said, look at this, let us make man in our own image according to our likeness. They will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the animals, all the earth, and the creatures that crawl on the earth. And then verse 27, so God created man in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female. So on the same day that man was created, so was dinosaurs. It's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool picture to think about. And one of those animals, whether it was a dinosaur-looking figure or not, was the behemoth. And this behemoth, we do know this, you guys, okay? And look what it says, which I made along with you. So he's calling out Job, and he says, look, this animal that I made is really powerful. Now, there's a comparison. You have to do this with Job. Okay, when you think of behemoth as a dinosaur, and then you think of Job as a human. Job eats fine foods, right? And I love what the commentators say here. He's weak, he was frail. His body was easily susceptible to damage. Do you know what I mean? Like he could be crushed by an animal. And man has to toil to earn his living. He's got to work for this. And he's always constantly like, maybe this animal's not afraid of anything. And yet what God says is, oh, I can take care of this. Can you take care of this animal? Can you take care of the behemoth? In fact, can you be in charge of this behemoth? Can you get this dinosaur to actually subdue itself under your authority? I don't think so. And in fact, he says in Job 40, when he's describing him, Kevin, if you go back to the end in verse 24, can anybody capture him while he looks on or pierce his nose with snares? You can't do that, Job. You might have a little pet parrot, but you ain't going to have a pet behemoth. Kevin, what do you got?
It's the next verse in Genesis that we didn't read, 128. Originally, God's creation of man was to subdue the animals.
It's good.
So he's playing back on, look at what's happened since creation.
That's a good perspective, Kevin. And really what God is saying is look, I'm going to give you two animals, the behemoth, and then in Job 41, he says the Leviathan. And I want to come back to the behemoth here for a second, but I just want, in Job 41, I feel like this is kind of important to say. He describes two animals that, Kevin, to your point, great point, we should be able to subdue them, but we can't anymore. And if you can't subdue the behemoth and the Leviathan, in the first 11 verses of Job 41, the Leviathan, he says it's hard to capture. And then in 12 through 25, you know what he does? He describes all of the anatomy of the Leviathan. And then in verses 26 through 34, he says, oh, by the way, your inability to capture the Leviathan again. So here he is saying, in the Leviathan, they have all these theories again, which we won't go through with animals. It could be a mythical sea monster, could be a dinosaur as well, it could be a whale, a dolphin, a tuna fish. Many people think a crocodile. Either way, what he's saying is at that point and at that time, you can't subdue this either. I'm going to pick two of my best animals. In fact, to go back to the behemoth, I love this point in Job 40. He says in verse 19, he is the foremost of God's works. This is like, in his eyes, the best animal of all of the animals. That's kind of a drastic statement. And he says, by the way, only his maker, only the creator can draw the sword against him. You can't even touch this animal. Look at all these characteristics of the behemoth. I'm not really sure when dinosaurs became extinct. I'm not really sure why we don't hear much about the behemoth or dinosaurs all throughout Scripture. We do know that Job is probably the oldest book of the Bible. And so many people would say, again, I cannot prove this, I'm just throwing out a theory for you, that they probably became extinct sometime. Many people would say, obviously, the flood took care of many of the dinosaurs. But many would then say eventually between Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, and the call of Abraham's, and Abraham's call would have been the time that they probably would have disappeared. Can I prove any of that? I'm not, don't test me on the science of this. I'm not saying to be an expert in that. I'm just saying this is one of the only times you see in Scripture, and that's probably when they say this is the time that they disappeared. I do love this. If you're an elementary school kid or a junior high kid or a high school kid, you probably are studying some form of the dinosaurs. Or maybe you've gone to your science museum, downtown Dallas, or maybe you've gone to the museum in Indianapolis. Wherever you've gone, and you've maybe come across all the bones of the dinosaurs. All I want you to think about is this. Just maybe one of those could have been the foremost of God's works. And he says back then, in Job's time, there's nobody that could have drawn the sword against that animal. Only God was in charge. And he says, Job, you ain't it. It's a pretty unique conversation. It's a great way to have a conversation, is talk about the behemoth and the Leviathan. All right, guys, that's Job 39 and 40. Have a great day, and we'll finish out Job, yes, very, very soon. Thanks.